Okay, and whoops. So before I open, I want to go over to GitHub and just make sure I've got everything and I'm up to date. So I'll just click on that fetch origin. I do have a couple changes from the last time that I haven't committed. Oh, and GitHub wants me to install a new version. I'll do that later. I'm gonna leave these here for now. I'll commit these later. But I just want to make sure to fetch the origin. Since I'm on a new computer, I don't want to miss anything that I had somewhere else. So I'm going to go to my game and just open up my project. And so I'm going to make a new level just so we can go over how this is going to look when you kind of get started from scratch. So I'll start a new 3D scene, and I'll just call this lighting. And I'm going to save this. So I'm going to hit Command S, and I'll just save this in my scenes. So I'll just put this in the main scene folder, and let's go to the 3D view. And so we're just going to go over some basic lighting stuff. So before we get started with that, I'm just going to put a few things in the scene so we can actually see what the lighting is doing. So I'll start with a ground. Actually, let me just copy the ground from my other scene. So I'm going to go to my level 1, and I'm going to take this ground and copy, and then I'll paste it in here. Okay, so I've got some ground. Let's change the color. I'm going to add in one of my default materials, so I'll add in this green grid material, so that'll give us a little bit of a sense of what the ground is doing. And then I'll just add in a couple different shapes because we're going to see that different geometries interact with light in different ways. So I'm going to add in a mesh instance, and I'm going to create a capsule and just bring this up here, and I'll move it over here. And I'll just call this my capsule. And I'm just going to throw a default little grid on there. And I'm going to create one more mesh, and I'll make a box. And I'll bring this up and move this over here. And I'll throw a grid on there. So we just have some basic materials and shapes just so we can see how the light changes when we interact with stuff. So I'll call this box. And I'm going to rotate the box just a little bit. And there we go. So I'm going to make this a little smaller over here. Okay, so you can see in my Godot scene so far, even though I haven't actually set any lights anywhere, we can see stuff and we can see shadows. So Godot has a couple defaults that it throws into the editor for us, and that's the first thing that we're going to look at. But I'm also going to drop my player in here real quick so I can play the game if I want to. So I'm going to run this. And we're going to see this is something that we've seen before, which is when I run this scene, assuming that it runs. So when I run this scene, suddenly that lighting and environment background are gone. So we just see the default gray background. The ground is just black. And we do see the materials on these shapes, but we don't see the shadows or anything like that. So even though there are some default lightings for our scene, they don't go into the actual scene when we run it. And so we can see these two options here to turn the lighting and the environment on or off. And so we can see that if I turn the lighting off, we lose those shadows, and if we turn the environment on or off, we lose that ambient light. So you used to have to add these on your own, but we can add them by clicking on this drop down. And if we turn on this preview and we bring in this environment, we can see there's a few properties here. We'll be able to manipulate these properties after we add it. So I'm just going to click Add Environment to Scene. And so the world environment adds a few basic things. It adds this background. This is like a procedural background. So instead of just having like a blue color or some clouds or something like this is actually, basically adding a gradient in here, but it's using math to kind of calculate where the horizon line is, essentially. And so we can change some of the properties for that. But it's also adding some ambient light. So you can see if I remove that world environment and turn off the preview, we don't get any light at all. That's what it looks like when there's no light. There's no, light adding to our meshes, so we don't see any of their materials. And when I add that environment, we get this ambient light. So we don't get shadows because there's no directionality to the light, but it's just adding a little bit of ambient color. That ambient basically means it's kind of like everywhere. So it's adding a little bit of ambient color to everything in the scene. So again, we don't get highlights, we don't get shadows because there's no direction to the light. A light typically comes from somewhere and has a direction. But in this scene, it's just ambient light so far. So let's add this environment. So now we have a world environment. So now if we run this, we do see that environment. We still don't have any basic lighting. So we can play with some of the parameters here if we click on the environment. Let's look up like that. I'll make this a little bit bigger. So we can change what kind of background we have. So if we just have a color, it's just going to be whatever, color is the default clear color, which is just gray. We can set a custom color. So if you just want one color in the background, you can set a color there. You can do a sky. So that'll put in a sky, and then we can change the sky a little bit. And then there's other stuff we can put in here if we want to, but we'll skip those for now. So you can put in a canvas that renders some other stuff. You can put in a camera feed. And then there's this energy multiplier. So if I turn this up, we get more ambient light. If I turn it down, we get less ambient light. And you could change that in the game with a script. So you could make it seem like it's getting, more like night or more like day by changing this energy multiplier property. Then our sky has some options as well. So you can see this is the procedural sky that's kind of built in, but you can create a new sky or you can load a sky. And then there's a few different things you can use here. I don't really recommend changing this too much unless you know more about this already. But you can add your own material and do different stuff like that. And then you can play around with some of these parameters, but I don't think you necessarily want to. What you will want to play with if we click on that procedural sky is here's where we can change the parameters of the sky. So we can change the color. So if you want a brighter color or something that's not blue, you can change that color there. And we can increase the brightness or the saturation. And you can see all of those changes are affecting how the light reflects on the other objects in the scene. So all of this is adding to the ambient light. We can also change the horizon color. So you can change that. Notice it looks kind of goofy here because we have that color coming up above the horizon. But we can change that with some of the other parameters. This curve sort of determines how the light is applied. So if it's really extremely up here, it doesn't apply it as much. If it's all the way extremely over here, then it applies it all the way. And this kind of eases from one value to the other. So their default is probably pretty good. If you want to exaggerate the color a little bit, you could bend it that way. If you want less color, you can bend it that way. You can multiply the energy here as well and do other stuff. Then we have the ground. So here's where we can change this part. So if we want to change the horizon color at the bottom, we can do that. And we can change the bottom color as well. So you can get something, this looks really crazy. This would be obviously for a non-realistic scene, maybe a dream sequence or something like that. But again, notice that all of these different colors that we're adding are getting added to our ambient light. And that also is determined by this curve as well. And we also can multiply that energy. So there's a lot of different parameters there. There's also this default sun that is added in here, and we can change where that shows up. Let's see if we can find that. I don't see that. Maybe my colors are too bright to see it right now. But let's see if we... can I reset this whole thing? No. Let's do a new sky. Okay, there we go. Maybe they don't have the sun up there anymore. Anyway, let's see. Okay. I think that's pretty much it. There's a couple other parameters in here. So there's the ambient light parameter, which you can just add another ambient light if you want to. So the sky is already adding some ambience, but if we want to add some ambient light, if we want, you know, to tint everything a certain color, we can do that here and turn that up. I'm not really seeing that very much. Oh, there we go. So if we turn the sky contribution off, we can add this ambient light here. Get some weird effects there, especially if you're using, you know, a non-realistic light. You can also get the sky ambience or a color or whatever you want. And then there's a bunch of other stuff here that get into like much more sort of like post-processing effects. Like if you want to add different things in here, don't really recommend doing this because you are going to start to see a dip in performance. And so until, you know, we kind of cover the basics, I would probably, you know, steer away from those. You can turn on fog if you want. That can be a good way to sort of like hide things in the scene. If you don't want to have like a massive scene where you can see way off into the distance, you can just add some fog in there. You can change the color of the fog if you want to, and you can animate this stuff or change this stuff with code as well. So there's a bunch of different parameters with the fog. You can kind of play around with those until you get something that you like. And then volumetric fog. I actually haven't used this very much. I'm kind of curious.
What's the difference between fog and volumetric fog?
Volumetric, so fog, I think it has to do with where it is in the graphics pipeline. Volumetric means that there's going to be like an area where it's adding fog. So it's adding like particles basically into the where it's calculating the light. Whereas fog is just kind of essentially adding like semi-transparent layer on top of everything. But yeah, you can play around with those a little bit. But yeah, so that's the world environment. We haven't even talked about actual lights yet, but you're going to want to set that up first. You don't need to have that if you have a world that takes place completely inside of a building or in a cave or something like that. You may skip this part. Or if you're doing something that's not super realistic, if you're trying to do like an N64 type style, you might skip this part. But most of you guys, I assume, will want to have some world environment. So then we have our default lighting. And if we look at this basically just adds this sun to the scene. And so, like I mentioned, the sun has a directionality. And so that's how we get things like highlights and shadows. So we can see, if we look at these geometries, there's parts of the box. And since the box has these flat surfaces, this whole surface is highlighted the same amount, versus these two undersurfaces are the same amount of darkness across the whole surface. On a, do you guys want the lights off? Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. On the capsule, you can see on a rounded surface, we see a little bit more sort of a gradient as the mesh rounds around. We have a highlight over here, and then it kind of fades into the darker side of the mesh over there. So we can add this sun into our scene, and that's a directional light. So there's a few different types of lights. Directional light is one of them. We'll look at a few others. With the directional light, it doesn't matter where it is in the scene. So you can see I can move it up and down. I can move it left and right. It doesn't change those shadows. It doesn't change the highlights. The only thing that matters with the directional light is the rotation. So if I rotate the light on the y-axis, you see that it's, you know, that changes the direction of that shadow. And then if I rotate on the x or the z axis, you're going to see, you know, the shadow gets longer or shorter depending on that direction of the sun. That's another thing that you could animate if you wanted to get the sense of, you know, a sunset or something like that. You could set those values through code or through an animation. So depending on what your setting is, you can move the sun up here if you want to get it out of the way. But again, it doesn't really matter where it is in the scene. And then depending on what time of day it is, you might, you know, have a longer shadow or a shorter shadow. And then it also, of course, affects the highlights. The farther away we're pointing, the less bright those highlights are going to be. Okay, so let's leave our sun up there. And so we've got this light in the scene. Let's look at a few of the properties that all of the lights have. So in our directional light, you can see at the top of the inspector, we have properties that are specific just to the directional light. And so there's shadow stuff that we can play with. Basically, that affects the shadow. So there's different rendering modes for the shadow. And it actually tells you some information about the performance. So orthogonal shadows are going to be faster for the engine to calculate. So if you've got a really complex scene with lots of shadows, that might save you a little bit of performance. I'm not sure what this stands for. We could Google that, but I'm going to do that later. And then we see average and slow performance. So with these, we get harder shadows. So they have harder edges, although we do see a little bit of a kind of fade at the edge. And then we can play with that a little bit. So we can play with where we break from the, you know, the darker shadow into that lighter edge. Let's see. Those ones are a little bit harder to see from here. Let's see if I turn that down. Yeah, then we see that changing. And then if I turn this one all the way down. So we basically have these like levels of where the shadow starts to taper off. And that's what makes the processing, you know, more intensive. If we do orthogonal, we basically just have one parameter for that. So I would leave these on the defaults for the most part, but if you start to see your performance lagging, like the game is running very slow or the frame rate is going down, that's one place where you might look to try to fix that. So then we can change the sky mode so it interacts with, you know, the light and the sky. We'll just leave that at the defaults. So then in our light section, these are properties that are common to all lights. So if we open up our light section, we have a color. This does basically what it sounds like. If I change the color of the light, it changes how the light is applied. And so, you know, we're going to start to see some weird stuff there. Usually with the sunlight, you can just go with white, or maybe you go with like a slightly yellow or orange. But you can kind of play around with those colors if you want something that's not totally realistic. Then we have the energy level, which works in a similar way. The more energy we have, the brighter the highlights, and we also get darker shadows. And then indirect energy, we don't really see a huge difference there, but that has to do with how the light is bouncing on other things. We might see that if we had more geometry in the scene. And then for the fog, this would be how much does the light interact with the fog, but we don't have fog right now, so we won't see that. We can change the angular distance. So this basically changes the amount of, or the angle that it's calculating the shadows and the highlights at. We can make the light negative, which is kind of fun. You get the opposite of whatever it is. So we see the shadow is filled in and the geometry is bright on the other side. And then the cull mask is basically you can have the light ignore certain objects. So if we turn all these off, most of the things are going to be on one. And if we turn that off, you can see the light doesn't affect that. So if you want a light that only affects certain things, you can use the cull mask there. There's some shadow properties, so we can turn the shadow off all the way. We can change the bias of the shadow. You can see that kind of changes where we get the shadow. The normal bias is kind of like the direction of the shadow. That doesn't make a huge difference. I think that's pretty much, you can change the opacity, so you might want a little less shadow. We can also blur the shadow a bit with this. So normally you want to leave the defaults for a lot of those unless you're going for like very specific looks. Okay, So that's our directional light. We just have a couple more lights, so let's look at those. So if we go and add into our scene, if we just look at light, you're gonna see our different types of light. So there's directional light, there's omni light, and spotlight. Omni light is a light that has a position, and the light just emanates in all directions. So that's good for things like lamps, for, yeah, basically any positional lighting that you might have in your scene. So I'm gonna bring up an omni light here, and you're gonna see, obviously with this one, the position matters. So the closer something is to this light, the brighter the effect of that light is gonna be. So if I move it here, you're gonna see the highlight get brighter, and then, if I move it over to the cube, we're gonna see the highlight get brighter over there. One thing that is a little confusing at first for some people is that you can't actually see the light itself. You just see the light that's coming out of it. So if you're trying to create a light, you're not going to see where you need to create, like, if you want to create a lamp, basically you need to create a mesh that represents the lamp and then add the light as well. So that can be kind of confusing at first. So with our omni light, the position matters. So we can put it in our scene to create, lighting effects and different highlights. And if I want to make a couple of these, I can duplicate this, and we can add a couple lights into our scene. And then for our omni properties, for the properties that are just for the omni light, we have the range. That's how far the light is going to affect. So if the range is very low, it's not going to affect a lot of things. If the range is higher, it's going to affect more stuff. Let's set this back to like 10. And so that is gonna, affect a lot of this area. And then you have the attenuation. This is sort of how the light drops off. So you can see if it's all the way up here, like that, it's just bright all the way through. And if it's a normal curve, it drops off a little bit. So the farther away something is, the farther it kind of fades. And then if we go all the way up here, you're basically not really applying the light. And then you have a couple shadow modes. I don't know if that really affects anything. We're not really getting a shadow here. Maybe if I turn up the range a little bit. Maybe it doesn't have, oh yeah, shadows aren't on. There we go. Okay, so if we turn on the shadows, now if we have both of these, we're gonna start to see, combinations of shadows. So we see where the shadows from both the lights kind of overlap here. So we have to turn the shadow on. It's on by default, I think, for the directional light, but I guess for the omni light it's not. And then we have different shadow modes. I don't think that makes a huge difference. And then it has all the same properties as we had before. So if we want a light with some color, we can do that. And if we want to increase the energy, we can do that. And so we get some different lighting effects. And so you can see that because I duplicated this light, oh no, it actually doesn't copy it. Okay, never mind. So if we wanted to get like, an interesting effect here, I could kind of combine two different light colors here. And so now we're getting this kind of like retro neon effect with these lights. And again, so the more of this stuff that you add into your scene, the more your performance is going to start to drop. So if you don't need shadows, don't add shadows. Don't add shadows to all of your lights unless it's really important. The more stuff that we add in here, the more and more the performance is going to be kind of lagging. But yeah, that's a good thing to just keep in mind as you're adding stuff in. We only have a few things in the scene, but as you start to add tons of geometry and moving stuff and physics, there's a lot for the processor to do. Okay, so there's one other type of light that we'll look at, and so that's the spotlight. And so the spotlight is kind of a combination of the directional light and the point light. The spotlight has a position, and it also has a direction. So we can see the spotlight here, and you can change the sort of size of this cone that shows where the light goes, and then we can rotate the light here. So let's go to spotlight and let's increase the range. You can see there it is. You can kind of see that light. It's very low right now. So let's turn up the energy. And then if we want to turn on a shadow, we can do that. And so spotlight obviously is what it sounds like. It has a direction and a position. So it's kind of a combination of the directional light. And so this could be good for, this also could be good for a lamp if you want a more specific direction on your lamp. And, it could be good in a lot of other circumstances, like a flashlight and different things like that. So if we point it this way, we don't need it to go that far, but we can increase the size, bring it out like that. And so you see those shadows and you see that light again. Other than that, it has all the same properties that you would expect from our lighting. So if we put these all together, we start to get this like very complex scene with lots of different shadows, different highlights, and so you can get some really interesting effects that way. Of course, when we start adding materials and textures into this, we start to get like, many more layers of complexity in terms of the visual look of our meshes. But adding some lights in is our first step. So I'll leave these here for now, and we'll have some workshop time for you guys to play around with these and add these into your scene. And then at 4, I'll talk about materials and textures for a little bit. So I'll stop the video here.